So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you happen to be. My name is Gareth Worthington, sci-fi author and volunteer for the BSFA, and I'm joined here today by Wale Talabi, who is a awesome author, award-winning author, and we're going to do a quick interview together today and just learn more about Wale and what he's up to. So in this series of interviews, I always ask the same question first. Okay, it's kind of like my thing. So I always ask why people write, and the reason I ask that is because often it drives what you write, and that reason may have changed over time. Why you started to write may not be why you write now. So perhaps you can let us know a bit about why you write.
I am chronically curious. I think I've always been that. I've been that way since I was a child, and I think I'm still the same. I love to know things. If I don't know something, I want to hear about it. I want to be told about it. I also have a very bad memory. So I very often I need to write down things as I'm learning about them, as I'm experiencing them. So writing kind of came early for me through that natural curiosity of reading and then wanting to write as I was learning about things. And it's evolved through different phases, as you can imagine. But I think in my teenage years, I discovered essentially the power of storytelling, of crafting a narrative around the things we're writing, rather than just taking notes, random notes and just observing things, but actually taking those observations and crafting them into a story consciously, which is something we all do subconsciously. It's how we make meaning of our lives. But then taking control of that and actively constructing narrative around observations, around things I was interested in, around things I had studied, information I had collected, kind of became a crystallized thing in my brain. And I've been doing it ever since. I've just never stopped writing.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I mean, we're both in STEM careers, right? So you're an engineer, as I
I
understand,
am.
and and I'm a scientist. I'm very similar. I pick up facts, little nuggets of information along the way, and turn it into narrative. So I completely understand where you're coming from. So, given that you're in the STEM field and engineering is very structured, right? And I think you're into like fluid mechanics and all this kind of highly complex stuff. Is writing is it like a chaotic something that you get to be more creative and free with, or are you as structured with your writing as you are in engineering?
I That's half of that question is correct and half is wrong.
Okay.
I have the same attitude towards both, but I am never structured.
Oh,
I
fair enough.
guess. I mean, I am structured in my thought processes and the way I approach problems, but I am also very creative
Yeah,
in my engineering. In fact, I love encountering problems that I haven't encountered before
yeah,
because that's where I get to play around the most. Applying different engineering principles, borrowing ideas from other fields, and
yeah,
seeing if I can find a parallel in mine and a way to make it work, a mathematical model that can help us understand what's going on. Those are the kinds of things I enjoy doing. So I love being creative in both
okay,
engineering and in my creative writing as well. And in fact, I kind of almost have a weird attitude towards engineering. People know me as the person that loses interest in the project once we've figured out how to do it. I
yeah,
don't actually want to go through the process of doing it.
yeah,
For
yeah, yeah,
me, the most interesting part is trying to figure out what to do. And once we have that, then the rest is
yeah,
process and procedure. And
yeah,
that's kind of the least interesting part to me.
yeah,
So it's almost similar with my writing is a lot of my writing is figuring out who are the characters, what is the main idea here,
yeah,
how can I layer different parts of the story on top of each other to talk about all the different things I'm thinking about, find parallels between religion, some scientific theory, some ancient historical event, and layer them on top of each other to make something new and interesting, some new narrative.
yeah.
So yeah, essentially, I love to be creative in both, and it is the same mindset to me.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense, and yeah, it sounds a little bit like me. I love coming up with the idea, and then I realize, oh, I actually have to write this thing now that I've come up with all these ideas. So,
Well, for me, the writing is also a problem solving
Okay.
task. Coming up with the idea is great. I love thinking about it, talking to
Yeah.
it. My wife always listens to me whenever I come up with some random ideas, like, oh, what about this?
Yeah.
Um, but then for me, sitting down to write is also the act of figuring out all these ideas that I've had in my head. How do I actually make them work?
Yeah.
So I enjoy that process as well. I guess the part I don't love as much as everything that comes after is now you have the story, you have to publish it, sell it to people, show it around, all that other stuff is like
Yeah.
not so interesting.
Yeah, yeah, no, that makes sense. But I mean, whilst we're on the subject of your writing, and I'm going to read this so I don't mess up the pronunciation. But your award-winning book, which was named one of the best books of 2023 by the Washington Post, I believe. Shigiri and the Brass Head of Oberfohren. Is that correct?
Almost there. Obalophon.
Almost. Ah, see,
Yeah,
I knew I'd
yeah.
butcher it. I
It's
apologize.
no, you just swap two syllables. It's okay.
That's all. Well, I do my best. So why don't you talk us a little bit about that book and something beyond the synopsis.
Okay, so my elevator pitch, or maybe it's a bar pitch,
Yeah.
is a former nightmare god and a succubus walk into the British Museum. That's basically the story.
Okay.
But it's about everything around that. It's essentially a supernatural heist story that takes place kind of in modern times, mostly 2016, 2017. But
Mhm.
there's lots of parts that take place in the past, kind of layering the story of the two main characters on top of each other. Because I also really love character-driven stories. So there's a heist, but I want to know who's on this heist and why does it matter? So
Yeah.
we spend a lot of time with these characters, and one of them is an ancient succubus. Um, who's been around for a long time. So we get to explore kind of her deep past when she was around
Mhm.
in ancient Ethiopia, in Algeria, hundreds of years ago, thousands of years ago.
Mhm.
We encounter gods, monsters, magicians, all sorts of things in the past as we build up to this heist that takes place. And obviously, they're there to retrieve an item of power for um, what I call the Orisha Spirit Company, because in the book I kind of reimagined the pantheon of gods of all religions and faiths and every belief system
Mhm.
as essentially operating companies or corporations.
Yeah.
And these corporations trade in faith, and the more followers you have, the more faith you have. It's fairly familiar kind of setup, I think.
Mhm.
Um, but then within this, they actually operate as companies with CEOs, human resources,
Yeah.
gods in tiered levels of management and employment. And Shigidi, who is the eponymous character, the title character, he starts off as a lowly nightmare god in the Orisha Spirit Company, and then he meets Norma the succubus, and they kind of break away from the company, go off, but then they get called back to basically execute this heist for one of the elder gods in the Orisha Spirit Company, who wants it back because he's trying to reclaim power. And this is an ancient artifact from Nigeria that was taken during the colonial period
Yeah.
and is now housed in the British Museum. So they need to get it back. And we just follow them through all these. They have their own romance, very awkward romance because they've just met. It's
Yeah.
kind of an enemies to lovers thing, but it happens in one night.
Yeah.
And then they need to figure out the parameters of their relationship going forward. So
Yeah.
it's a love story, it's an adventure story, it's a historical story, it's a
Yeah.
heist story.
Yeah.
It's a lot of different stories layered on top of each other, which I think is fun.
I think that's awesome. I can really see that as a TV series, like a limited, 12 episode TV series. It just rings, it has that feel to it. So
I hope so too. I'm hoping that happens too.
yeah, okay, well, I would definitely watch that. I mean, clearly you're drawing from your experience having lived all over the world, right? I mean, you talk about London, Nigeria, you're in Australia now, I believe. So you're drawing a lot from your experience of living abroad.
Correct. Yes. I wanted the feel of the book to feel sometimes the way I felt especially in my I'd say my mid 20s when I was traveling internationally quite a lot.
Hmm.
Lived for a few months in Mexico, but I was traveling everywhere for weeks at a time. I
Hmm.
lived in Malaysia for 10 years, now currently living in Australia.
Okay.
And I wanted the book to have that feel that it's mostly grounded in two, maybe three locations,
Hmm.
but that it moved and things happened globally. Because I also wanted to use that as an opportunity to show the depth of experience that an old character like Norma has,
Yeah.
a succubus that's been around and seen the world change so much, as well as gods that have existed since people first started believing in them.
Yeah.
So obviously there's long histories there, and these histories span times and places. And I
Yeah.
wanted that to come across in the book, but also to feel the way I've often felt, just encountering different cultures, different sensibilities,
Yeah.
different ways of being as you move towards a goal.
Yeah. No, that makes total sense. You were in Malaysia, you were in Kuala Lumpur is that where you were?
I was there for
Yeah.
10 years. Yeah.
Because I was in Singapore for about 3 years, so I know the area well. So a lots of
Right.
good, rich history there to draw upon. So
Yeah.
given all of that stuff, someone who's read your book, what is it you think they'll be talking about most? They finish the book, they put it down, and they go and tell their friend. What do you think is the one thing they'll be talking about?
I I think I have some, it's anecdotal evidence, but it's happened
Okay.
enough that I think I'm considering it empirical. Most people talk about the succubus Norma. I've gotten comments saying, why is the title character Shigidi? It's basically a book about Norma the succubus.
Yeah.
Because she's fascinating. She's morally complex. Some people hate her. Some of the early reviews, I think maybe 5% of them thought she was immoral because she's a succubus, so she uses lust as power. So there are sex scenes. There are parts of the book where she uses sex as power to basically steal the life force from people rather than trying to get them to believe in her.
Hmm.
But also people see her as kind of this woman that has made her own way in a world where everything is corporatized and run by elder gods that are mostly male. And
Yeah.
she's just insisting that she wants to be on her own, and she just negotiates the deals she needs to survive.
Yeah.
So I think, and she's a memorable character. She has this push-pull desire to be with someone and have a connection, but also to not have that because of things from her past, bad experiences that she's had, which I get into in the book a bit. So I think she's a fascinating, complex, sometimes polarizing character,
Hmm.
which to me is the hallmark of kind of, I guess, a
Yeah.
great character.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No,
So
I would
people
totally.
will be talking about Norma, I think.
Okay,
Um,
fair enough. And I completely agree with you. I think that makes a character interesting. One-dimensional, like, super moral, who cares, right? You want someone who, creates a visceral response, good or bad. So I love that.
yeah. And
Absolutely.
that is kind of the way she appeared in my mind when I
Yeah.
first wrote a short story featuring this character. Is she was just it was a single scene story where she's in a bar, seduces someone, has sex with them, steals their soul, and she's kind of internally conflicted about it, but she does it because that's her way of surviving. That's where her power comes from.
Yeah.
And I just kind of fleshed out who she was from there. So yeah, I think she's an interesting character, and I'll definitely be writing more stories with both her and Shigidi, just also set in this world. Because I guess the second thing people might be talking about in the book is that in a way, it's almost a satire of modern hyper-capitalism by having even religion or religious organizations and faith running as corporations.
Yeah.
And there's parts of the book that are almost a bit humorous, where I work in the world. I work for a big multinational corporation, so
Yeah.
a lot of my experience comes from there, and board meetings, targets, KPIs, all that kind of stuff. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's all in the book, so people talk about that as well.
Yeah. That makes total sense. And sounds like it does deserve more books as well. So I'm looking forward to those. Which kind of brings me on to kind of the next topic a little bit is like, your last book, which came out, and it's actually an anthology, I believe. So
A
Convergent.
collection, yeah.
Yeah,
Convergence
Convergent
problems.
Problems. So can you talk to us a little bit about that one that came out this year, I believe?
Yes, so Convergence Problems came out in February of this year. And it's a collection of stories, some of which have been previously published, but several of which have not. And they mostly they're mostly science fiction stories focused on kind of exploring the world when new technology is introduced, especially near future technology. A lot of it is focused on AI, digital consciousness,
Mm-hmm.
a bit about space travel. There's a story in there about Mars exploration, but it's mostly exploring all of that classic science fiction. How
Mm-hmm.
can the world change when new technologies are introduced? But mostly from an African lens. Because I'm Nigerian, I'm very fascinated and interested in talking about and thinking about African philosophy, African science and technology,
Mm-hmm.
African history. So there's a lot of that that comes across in the stories in Convergence Problems. And I would say the kind of centerpiece of the collection, which the collection is scaffolded around this one novella that is in that collection, and it's called Ganger. Um, and Ganger is set in a post-climate disaster, almost dystopia, even though it seems like a utopia at first, in this city that's protected from a ruined climate. And it follows a young girl um, living in the city where everyone has nanomachines embedded in their brains that are constantly recording their mind states. So whatever you're thinking of doing, whatever you want to do is being monitored. And there are machines and devices in this city that can either provide those things for you or stop you from doing things that you want to do if it
Okay.
doesn't align with what the person that builds the city wants. And in a way, it's like everything is provided for you, but
Mm-hmm.
also how much freedom do you have?
Yeah.
And I use that as a starting point to explore that idea of digital consciousness, artificial intelligence, climate change, and I layer it on top of a traditional Nigerian folktale that I found really resonated well with the themes of that story. So I kind of switch between retelling that folktale
Mm-hmm.
set, in the past, as well as telling the story of this character in the future.
Yeah.
And I think the two kind of weave into each other really nicely. And a lot of the stories in the collection thematically are linked to that is technology, African philosophy, African traditional myths, mythology, and folk tales, and how all these things intersect with each other. Yeah, and I guess the last thing I'll mention is it's very playful with form. So if
Okay.
you enjoy reading science fiction stories from in unusual formats or in unexpected ways of telling a story, it's probably a collection you would like.
Awesome. Well, that sounds amazing, and I love the fact that you're in the STEM field and you're a person writing these kind of things. I don't know if you read much of Yuval Harari, but he dedicated a whole chapter to his last book, 21 Lessons for the 21st Century, to the importance of good science fiction because it's the only lens many people have to what does the future look like, and that's why everybody's afraid of Skynet and AI, and that's not what's going to happen. So we need books like yours who really explore the realities and the nuances and layer it on top of stories we can relate to. So I really love that. Okay,
Yeah, thank you.
so with that in mind, what's next for you? What's your what are you working on next?
I am presently working on what should be my second novel.
Okay.
No release date yet, nothing fixed. I'm hoping to have that done quite soon. And it will be a science fiction novel. It's a near future, I would say science fiction thriller
Mm-hmm.
with cyberpunky elements, but it's mostly a near future science fiction thriller. That's also a bit about a meditation on the nature of memory and consciousness and why it's important, as well as connectedness for humanity. So those are the things I'm working on now, and I'm enjoying that. It's a story that's been in my mind for a long time, so I'm happy to finally like sit down and work it out,
Yeah.
get it all out there. In the meantime, I have a few short stories that are going to be published later this year.
Okay.
One of them in the latest 12 Tomorrows anthology from MIT Press. I think it's called Deep Dream.
Okay, yeah.
And that's stories about artificial intelligence and art.
Mm-hmm.
There's 12 stories in there, and mine is one of them. It's about an an AI artist, and it's set 3 million years in the future.
Oh
So
wow,
it's one
okay.
of my it's actually a sequel to the first story in Convergence Problems. So if you do get Convergence Problems, you read it, you like
Yeah.
it, you're ready for the sequel that takes place 3 million years in the future, and it's one of the more ambitious things I've written. So I'm
Yeah.
happy for people to see that in the world. I also have another story which is a kind of historical horror story,
Okay.
literary horror story that should be coming out from Subterranean Press later in the year as well.
Okay.
It's set during World War II, but in East Africa, one of the smaller fronts of the war that doesn't get talked about quite a lot. But I explore that and look at the shadow of colonization and war. Yeah, so I have those two stories coming out, and I am also working with a collective, a group of African writers, on something called the Southieverse, which is a shared world that we all had input in creating. And it's a setting and a playground for stories, and we all tell stories set in the Southieverse. I edited the first anthology of stories set in the Southieverse last year. It was
Okay.
called Mother Sound, the Southieverse anthology. And we're working on more stories. So you can expect to see Southieverse stories popping up everywhere in
Yeah.
the next year or two as well, while I'm finishing up the next novel.
Okay. Sounds really good. Okay. And then so sort of closing out a little bit, you mentioned you're writing horror as well, which I find interesting. If you could write a completely different genre, what would you write?
Oof, that's interesting because I don't know what genre would I guess probably detective stories.
Okay. Yeah.
Um, I, but the thing is, I'm not so sure it's that different from science. There's an interesting um, genealogical connection between traditional science fiction and detective stories. A
Yeah.
lot of science fiction stories proceed as mysteries.
Yeah.
So I don't know if it's that different, but that's my answer, and I'm sticking to it. I'd probably do detective fiction.
Yeah, no, that's fair enough. That makes sense. Okay. So, and are you going to be in the next few months? Are you attending anything? People can meet you, cons, anything?
Yes, this weekend I am virtually attending the Nebula Awards and ceremony. I don't know if this video will come out in time for that
Yeah.
to still be relevant, but I will be in Glasgow for Worldcon um, later this year in August.
Hmm.
So I have that all planned out. I don't think any of the panels have been announced yet, but my publisher will be making a presence. My UK publisher, Gallant,
Hmm.
will be there, and I think they'll have a stand and everything in the dealer's room. So I will
Yeah.
probably be there. People can meet me, can get copies of books. I'll sign them for you, tell you funny stories, maybe
Yeah.
even do a TikTok dance. Who knows? Whatever works these days.
Yeah.
I'll also
Marketing these
be
days. Yeah.
I'll also be on panels, hopefully talking about really interesting things. And yeah, people can catch me just around on the internet as well. I'm online at W Talabi in on most of the social media. So if you just search for that, you'll find me. And yeah, just say hello wherever you see me, virtually or in person.
Perfect. And that was my last question. Where can people find you online? But you answered that one. So I think we can end it there. And thank you so much for your time today. And I look forward to picking up your books. And I'm at Nebula, but virtually. I'm hosting office hours there, I think. So hopefully
Oh,
I'll
nice.
find you online.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Gareth. This was
Great.
fun.